have some question and answer time with Karen, and then we'll turn it over to Chris Brewster from Gould Evans, and possibly Matt. I see Matt's online tonight as well. So we'll continue our discussion on the high-level topics of sustainability as we've been doing the high-level discussions on the other topics leading up tonight. So that being said, I will introduce Karen Montanez, and she can provide her PowerPoint presentation for us. So Karen.
Sorry about that. I thought I'd unmuted, but I didn't. So can everybody see my screen? All right. So I'm going to just kind of go over a high level the Green Construction Code and how it may apply to the CodeNet project. The Green Construction Code, while it says construction, a lot of it actually doesn't apply to the construction of the building, but applies more to the site and the overall project. It focuses mostly in 6 areas, but I do want to point out that the Green Construction Code is for commercial construction and not for residential. But it does focus on site sustainability, water use, energy efficiency, the indoor environment, and materials, resources, and construction and plans for operation. I'm primarily going to focus on site sustainability, water use efficiency, materials and resources, and construction and plans for operation. The International Energy Conservation Code deals more with the actual energy efficiency of the building itself. And we have already adopted the 2018 Energy Code, and next year we'll be adopting the most current one, which would be the 2021. Site sustainability looks at the building envelope, but it also looks at the site itself. So it will have requirements whether you're building in a brown field, a gray field, or a green field area. Because Inglewood is landlocked, we don't have quite as much greenfield area, etc. So it doesn't apply quite as much. It does require a pre-designed site inventory of the parcel that would be under construction, looking at any of the natural resources and finding out whether those need to be protected or not. Once again, since Inglewood is pretty much built out, this doesn't apply quite as much as it would for another jurisdiction. Part of that would require the removal of invasive plants, which we do have issues with, as we all know, and looking at the using of more natural plantings and adaptive plants. It also looks at stormwater management. I know Denver has encouraged the use of vegetated roofs, so it provides for that, but it also looks at paving, rain gardens, looking at doing vegetated swales for conservation of water conservation. It also looks at mitigating the heat island effect. We all have been out on a parking lot and just felt that heat that's coming up from there. So the Green Building Code looks at that, looks at providing shading by either trees or by the structures themselves. But it also requires that the structure within 10 years have shading as well. As you can see, 30% of an east or west wall would need to be shaded either by some man-made structure or by vegetation. The code also looks at reduction of light pollution and sets up lighting zone districts. Part of the Green Construction Code is also looking at pedestrian walkways, bicycle paths, parking, Also looking for site vehicle provisions for electric vehicles or smartway vehicles. Basically providing preferred parking spaces, requiring a certain amount of parking spaces, uh, meet charging requirements for electric vehicles. Also, it looks at water use efficiency, mostly through landscape design. A big portion of our water usage goes into landscaping. And so it looks at how to, reduce the amount of water that needs to be used to maintain landscaping, but also requires the landscaping to eliminate some of that heat island effect. Um, it also looks at the use of water within the building. It provides for energy efficient equipment, washing machines, things of that nature. And because this applies to commercial buildings, it looks at doing water bottle filling stations wherever you have drinking fountains. And I think you probably have been in buildings where you're seeing more and more of this so that you can just refill your water bottle rather than just drinking from the fountain. During construction, it looks at the waste management coming off a construction site during demolition as well as during construction, trying to keep that material from ending up in landfills. We're starting to see more and more instances where things are done off-site. So an example of this would be Swedish Hospital. So their bathroom units, they're doing those off-site. And so they build it off-site, they come in and they're going to, install it by cranes, and it eliminates the waste because when it's done off-site, everything is, measured out much more carefully. When you're on site, you've seen the waste from a construction site, we measured this wrong, we toss it, but when it's off-site, it's much more detailed. The code also looks at doing what happens after the building is occupied. So it encourages or requires actually areas for recycling, for paper, for cardboard, plastics, metals, etc. So rather than just, say an apartment complex, they'll put out a recycling bin, maybe not. It might just be just a trash bin. But under this code, it requires them to provide for recycling of materials. And in some areas, it also requires that you have separate containers for collections of electronics, batteries, even items that can be reused. So that, if somebody wants to get rid of clothing, they could actually do it on site rather than, take it to another site. And once again, that's just trying to keep materials out of the landfill. And even after a project has been completed, they have to provide plans of operation. So how they're going to maintain their landscaping, how they're going to maintain their recycling, and submit reports about that as well to the jurisdiction. So future plans, I think I just need to point out that, as I said, the Green Construction Code is primarily for commercial construction. The city does have quite a bit of commercial construction, a lot of the new apartment buildings and some other new buildings, but we also have a lot of new residential construction. And so perhaps part of this development of a new development code, we might look at how we can provide for green construction throughout. Not many jurisdictions have adopted the Green Construction Code as a whole. Denver has adopted it, but they use it more for very large projects and they provide financial incentives for companies or for developers that utilize the Green Construction Code. Same can be said for some of the other jurisdictions. Many places are just choosing to, rather than adopt the Green Construction Code, adopt green codes within their current codes. So part of, the Uniform Development Code, some things within the building code, some things within perhaps engineering or stormwater management codes. There's several areas in which the Code Next Steering Committee could look at different things to incorporate into this project that would be green construction. Part of that would be the landscaping requirements. That would fall more under the development code rather than it would the building code. Same with parking, etc. And when you're looking at some of those things, so you have preferred parking. And then you also have requirements of whether you want to do EV capable park spaces, EV ready spaces, or EV installed spaces, and how many you would want in any particular project. And just to kind of give you an idea, an EV capable would mean the panel, the electrical panel has the capacity for a circuit for an EV charging station. EV ready, they would actually have the raceway go all the way out to a junction box or actually install the outlet for the charging station. And then an EV installed would be the full on charging station. And even when looking at parking, you have to take into account with the new code cycle that's coming up, they're also putting in requirements for accessibility, which had not been in there before, so that somebody that has an accessible parking space will also have the ability to have EV charging and have the necessary clearances for a wheelchair or whatever they may need. Through this, we'd have to coordinate with several departments, including the planning and zoning side, look at stormwater management and water usage. Part of the Green Building Code, they actually encourage the use of, collecting rainwater. Well, as we know in Colorado, that's not allowable by law for commercial buildings. It is allowed for residential. I think it's 250-gallon barrels. I'm not quite sure. And it will allow for townhouses, I believe, up to 4 houses, but not for commercial. And that's a lot of things with, the water usage is that, there's a lot of water right issues that come into play. And so that would be something that would have to be looked at closely to make sure that we are not violating anything of that nature. So for the building division, we're looking at adopting the 2021 codes in late 2022. We follow the lead of Denver. We're required per contract to adopt the same code cycle as they do within 6 months. So they're currently working on their own code cycle, and they're looking a lot at the energy codes and adding some additional green codes, or stretch codes is actually what they're referred to within their existing codes. And like I said, again, they have adopted the green code, but not as a mandatory code. And it is for very specific projects. They actually assign one person to work through that project from beginning to end and coordinate everything. So it has to meet certain limits as far as size and costs. And that is pretty much all I have on my slides here. So if anybody has questions or Anything?
Christine?
Thank you. Does the IGCC have anything on solar?
Not as requirements.
And what about cool roofs? Does it have anything on cool roofs?
Not as requirements. You know, they all, it's pretty much if installed, here is what you must do, but it is not required.
Thanks.
Kate Townley?
Hi, sorry if I missed this in the beginning. Is there any language or anything around like pesticide use or anything like that for that code?
No, not within the green construction code. So the green construction code is kind of it's in some ways it's very basic and in some ways it's very detailed. Yeah, I think in our instance, we would have to look at what does the city of Inglewood want to do and what do they want to accomplish? So there's two ways to do it. You could either adopt the green building code with an enormous amount of amendments to fit the city's needs and to comply with the requirements of the state, like I said, for water usage and things. Or you can adopt green codes within the existing codes, like the Code Next project.
And Judy?
A couple of things. Thanks for the presentation. It's not clear to me where planning and zoning needs, what items planning and zoning would need to address in terms of this rewrite to assist in this. We had a discussion on the whole electric vehicle and parking, and there was a lot of discussion on whether or not that belonged in the development code or in the building code. So there's some confusion or there's not clarity there. Would you be making recommendations that we modify some of the permitted uses for commercial areas or light industrial areas? I guess I'm not fully clear on what our, as the Planning and Zoning Commission doing this rewrite, what you need from us to consider in support of your green code. So I don't know if you have the answer to that right now, but I don't have clarity on that.
And I think that might be something that would have to be discussed a little bit more, because parking requirements typically fall under the planning and zoning side. Maybe those parking requirements of how many spaces need to be EV, or how many, need to be preferred parking, and do that by project, much like your parking regulations are now. An apartment complex is going to have different parking requirements than a light industrial building. And so it might be better to do those numbers within the planning and zoning side with the actual inspection and everything of everything on the building side, so that the two would actually work together.
Kate Townley?
Barring that, I'm still not clear on what you need from us. We can talk about parking all day long. We already do that. But what do you need from us?
It would be to make that determination of how many parking spots you would want.
Not on parking, not parking. Anything else that you need from us?
And that water usage that goes with that. And then also as to, so under like the green building code, it requires the shading. So within 10 years, a building needs to be shaded a certain amount of certain percentage. But my question not necessarily to you, just overall, is how do you ensure that they maintain that landscaping? And we have that same issue now. You know, we have landscaping requirements, but nothing that says within 10 years you have to maintain that landscaping. So it'd be somewhat the same, but so landscaping would be another thing. You guys already look at walkability, bike paths, parking for bikes, etc. So maybe take a look at what some of the things are suggested in the, or that are required in the green building code, and see if those could be incorporated into your rewrite of this code.
Kate Townley?
Sure. I was just going to say, kind of in response to Judy's question, the things that I see would be incorporating those suggested elements around landscaping and where landscaping would be located. I don't remember in the 1500 page long code with landscaping how, like, what exactly it says. You know, I know that there's a requirement for X amount of landscaping, and then there's usually a plant palette and things like that. But are we, you know, are we working with whoever's building to basically put the right kind of tree in the right place to really be able to then, you know, mitigate heat island and things like that? So are there things that we could do in the code, or are there ways that if you were going to do like a PUD and there's more room for negotiation, that you could reduce landscaping over here, but just make sure it's all in the places that it's really going to have the biggest amount of impact? So those are the things I was seeing. And then I think being able to go back in and see what are some of the details in bicycle parking and pedestrian access and things, and does the code kind of meet some of those same things that are in this building code, but it would be more so in the land use code. And then I guess I was just curious, like Enterprise Green Communities has, I think, their own set of standards and things like that. And do you have a sense if this is similar to that, or if that one is, I don't
I'm
know.
not familiar with that, but if I'm understanding it, it's pretty much just a code or standards that would apply to a specific jurisdiction, to their needs, which is basically what the zoning code is. It's to the city of Inglewood, not Golden, not Denver. It's the needs of our community and not another. And what are the overall goals for the community for sustainability?
Do we have any more questions? Christine?
Do we have another presentation after this? Because if so, I could hold some of my questions and comments till that, if they're not particular to the IGCC.
We do, Christine. We'll
Okay.
have another.
Thanks.
Yep.
Perfect.
I don't see any more hands. Oh, Kate Townley.
Got it in.
You
I
did.
Sorry. I was just wondering, has the city considered, like, is there any kind of modeling or things that, you know, it's great to have the building code and each building will make an impact, but it's sort of like, how many buildings do we need to have doing this to really make an impact and make a difference? And so I didn't know if the city had done any modeling or things like that in terms of what would be the impact of, you know, implementing this building code.
Not that I know of. You know, we just kind of were given the task of looking at the green building code and seeing how or what could be incorporated, whether it be the entire code or just portions of it. So, you know, and there's a lot of things that go into sustainability. You know, they're talking about doing total electrification, but then you also have the issue, can the infrastructure sustain that? So you have to work with like Excel Energy to see where they're at. There's a lot of different things that play into it. I know some jurisdictions are requiring that, they just don't do gas-fired appliances, that they strictly do electric. But then you also, where do you come? What do you do with existing housing, and when do you require them to upgrade, or do you set a certain, age limit of the home, or where do you draw the lines on those? So.
Anyone else? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone. Wade?
Thank you.
So if anybody thinks of any more questions for Karen afterwards, just email them to me, and we can get those answered for you and sent back to you. Otherwise, thank you, Karen. Appreciate it. And we'll dive into Chris's presentation now.
Thanks, Wade, and good evening, everyone. There's going to be quite a bit of overlap from Karen's, but I'm going to try to bring us back to the development code, and some of the good questions on where do things belong are going to run throughout this presentation. And we won't have the answers to all of those, other than we know that we want things to coordinate and make sure that both the development code, which is sort of planning, zoning, development review, and the building code, which is more construction, execution, operation, are communicating well together. And again, we will just need to be mirroring each of those as we go through the discussions. Let's see. So just a reminder, this is one of a series of our high-level topics. So we're on our third substantive one now on sustainability for tonight, and then the upcoming ones, again, parking, walkability, street design, walkability, we covered at our last meetings. And then over the next few meetings or several meetings, we'll be getting into the neighborhood housing issues, 3 distinct issues on that. And the big picture of where we're going is these discussions with you all at the touching on the priority issues from the code assessment will help us structure our more detailed engagement plan as we get to the first of the year, where we'll be going out to a broader audience to discuss issues, and maybe discuss issues in more detail with technical folks, or discuss issues at a higher level with the general population, or combinations of both. And then that's going to prepare us to begin drafting some of these solutions, where we do begin figuring out where things go exactly, how we want this to come together. And that's when we'll be coming back to you all with things that we'll be perhaps asking for your reaction or specific direction on options and strategies. So we're just not there yet. And these are preliminary conversations that are really helpful, particularly for us to get oriented to your situation, your issues, and your policies. But reminder on this schedule, we won't begin drafting anything that phase 3 part till at least after the first of the year. So we just want to get a handle on these issues and make sure we're getting all the information coordinated so we can make informed decisions. So what is sustainability? When we do development codes, we're always orienting them back to your plans and policies. So this is an excerpt from, if you're not familiar with the sustainability plan, just recently adopted, has 10 major goal areas. Each of those goal areas has some very specific programmatic things. This plan is actually written as a plug-in to the strategic plan, which I'll show in a minute as well. But there's a lot of things that touch on development and development code related issues. There's a lot of things that don't. There's a lot of things about city investment, city infrastructure, city operations. And then there's a lot of things about programs, incentives, policies that are non-development related. So we're kind of sifting through this to figure out which ones are the high priorities that relate to the development code. Other plans and policies that are going to impact how we view sustainability for this project or at least how we begin discussing it. Obviously, the comprehensive plan, many of those high level sustainable issues, making sure your community is resilient, making sure your community is walkable, mixed use, productive, using land resources as efficiently as you can, investing in infrastructure that sustains development and productivity. Those all of those big picture things we plan on addressing, not necessarily because of your sustainability policies, but because your land use and development policies are driving you that way, making walking, biking, and transit the norm, and putting more mixed use, mixed density patterns in to let places be invested in for the long haul, making sure buildings and sites are invested in for multiple different uses over time. All of those things that we always address, that it's basically planning, doing the best we can for the longest term with few resources. Planning itself is a sustainable profession. So those are all will be themes throughout from the comp plan. When we get further into the code assessment that you recently did, there's some very specific things on sustainability and green infrastructure we want to be paying attention to. And then again, the strategic plan that's on the right there, many of those things were the plug-in for that sustainability plan that was on the previous slide. And again, from that list, you can see a lot of things that are development related. You can see a lot of things that aren't necessarily development related, but that are more operation and program related. So that leads us to how can the development code impact sustainability? And we tend to think of it as these 4 options are always on the table for every issue. In other words, and maybe even the electric vehicle parking is a good one to consider these options as a lens, and the options can be different for every single issue, and we can kind of craft them as strategically as you want. But the first one is it's a development code. It's a set of regulations, so we can always make the best practice, in other words, the best sustainable option, the minimum requirement, so that we guarantee that those things are happening. And that's a choice to make, and it has some implications that we need to be concerned about and think about. The other next level down is we can promote it, make sure that the development code is setting up incentives that make the right choice easier, that perhaps make the right choice have some other tangential benefits, or that just makes the right choice coordinate with other things that are possibilities. So it's an option, but it comes with benefits beyond just simply doing it. The third level down is just simply enable it. We want to make sure that the code isn't inadvertently or maybe even due to competing priorities, making sustainable choices not possible. That's often the case. Or if codes are silent to things, oftentimes they may not be being done just because of not paying attention to it. So the codes can do a lot even when things aren't required, to simply remove barriers and enable them. And then the last one is a lot of where we plug into Karen's conversation as well. Although she was listing many things that are directly development code related, there's other things that are building code related. There's other things that are operational or policy level related. So the development code should also coordinate and make sure we're leveraging those non-development code issues. So again, we'll come back to these often, and we'll come back to these even in non-sustainability issues. We always think of codes at these 4 levels. So then on the specific topics, and again, this list is where there's substantial repeat from Karen's presentation, but we kind of group sustainable topics into these 5 subcategories. You all that obviously think about these issues often and are experienced with them, so we may be missing things. I'll probably leave this slide up for a bulk of the discussion to see where we're at on some of these. But energy use, transportation habits, some of those big picture things that really have, I guess I should back up a minute. One of the anecdotes we've heard from the planning profession is, I work in an architecture firm, and we kind of have a little professional battle with the architects who are concerned about sustainability. But we always tell them that, yeah, you guys are just doing the buildings, and you're getting a lot of buzz and mileage out of talking about green buildings, but that's only 30% of a site's energy use. Most of it comes from where you put the building, how you get there, how you use it and access it. And that's 70%, and that's in the planning realm. So that number is anecdotal, and I've seen some studies of it, but the idea is the transportation habits and and some of the things about getting to locations and all of those things that are inherent in your plan are going to go a long way to a lot of sustainability goals anyway. But there's certainly things to be thinking about under those to make sure we're promoting them. Energy use is an interesting one. A lot of things Karen talked about were energy use, from everything from how you design and orient your site to take advantage of passive heating and cooling, to things as of what kind of appliances are going into buildings. So some things clearly in the development code realm, other things clearly not in the development code realm, and how do we filter those? It's also one of the ones where it's pretty easy to start to see some potentially competing issues that I think we need to have our eyes open for on the energy use, because in one sense, the passive heating, cooling, and the heat island provisions are all about building shade for sites. In the other sense, we've already had some preliminary discussions on, hey, if someone invests in solar, do we need to protect their access to solar, and where trees might be viewed as a negative in some of those cases. So some of those things will be very site specific on what's the right solution. But we know going into the code, we know we'll be able to help balance and make those choices and help prioritize some of those things. Water, obviously, Front Range water is at top of mind all the time, and Karen did an excellent job of hitting some of the issues and some of the complexities of that. One of the easiest things I think that we will be able to do, and there were some interesting numbers that were coming out of the Green Construction Code about irrigation, but the Front Range is full of good models and good data on xeric standards for landscape. The things that the WaterWise program that the Denver Council of Regional Governments puts out, they're really excellent guides, and they actually have a really great and high level design element to them. It's not about, when some of those things first came out, it was people had an aversion maybe to them, but they're very, at least for me from an outsider, I think they're very distinctive and very regionally appropriate, and some of them are becoming great identifiers for cities. But getting more xeric standards in your development code will probably be something we will want to be considering and discussing. The bottom category are things that are more about mitigation. Karen mentioned lighting and light pollution, which are a concern in places, making sure we're using energy efficient lighting for lighting outdoor. Those things all are implicated by the development code. Even though some might get into technical and construction specifications, we can certainly begin to set standards and benchmarks for that. Some of the stormwater issues, tree protection, I mentioned trees up in the energy use and passive heat and cooling. Then things about preserving habitat or restoring and remediation if there's any brownfield sites. Some of those things that jumped up on Karen's site selection provisions for the Green Construction Code. Kind of circling around, I skipped over a little bit on the building performance and construction. A lot of those are usually the ones that are more squarely and directly related to the building code, and not so much in the development code, but they are things where we look for standards that would somehow be viewed as an impediment to achieving these, whether it's the energy efficiency of the building itself, whether it's how do we have a list of materials that are regionally appropriate, low construction. There's model codes out there that can be plugged in, and I think the building department is probably better suited to help with our discussion on those than we will be. But we want to be, again, we want to be coordinating so that both codes are working well together. With that, I don't really have any other detailed information or things to think about other than this is the start of the conversation. We know sustainability and green infrastructure is something that the code assessment said we need to be paying attention to. And I just open it up for any thoughts or discussion on this list or anything that triggers a question from Karen's presentation.
Any questions?
I've got a question on Karen's presentation. A third of the area for a green space, trees and whatnot, only a third of it can be irrigated. In this climate, that's really not, I don't know if that's feasible or not, but for trees and grass, it's not going to work very well. But I can see the point in limiting the irrigation because of the water usage. We're going into pretty much a permanent drought all the time. So I don't know what the answer is to that, but I would like to see more trees and more grass areas. Maybe use a less water requiring grass, like something that's takes a lot less water than Kentucky bluegrass. I don't know. Is there any anything on that can be covered? Is there any?
Yeah, I'll just chime in quickly, and then if Karen has more information from that provision from the Green Construction Code. I know the water-wise models that Dr. Cog puts out and the Zurich standards do talk about both things you mentioned. One is, do we limit, and this is one of the things that kind of shows the complexity of it. It's a little bit hard to come up with a number. So for example, the 1/3, 1/3 may be not substantial and a good benchmark for a small site. 1/3 could be a huge area for a large site, and you don't want that irrigated as well if it's not serving a function. So just determining what that number is can be a little bit tricky, but the principle of we want to reduce the amount of irrigated landscape is a good starting point. And then the second thing you mentioned is, and it's very easy then to go, okay, based on our region, our climate, what are the things that won't survive without irrigation? And let's kind of nix those off and make sure we're prioritizing things that will survive through low water periods and things like that. So those models will be what we will go to try to incorporate some of those into your landscape standards.
Townley?
I was just going to comment on Carl's question because I think a big part of that is that it can't be irrigated with potable water. So there is that possibility if the city were to invest in more gray water systems, or like in Denver and other cities, you see the purple boxes, which is reclaimed water that then can be used for irrigation. It sounds like you could use that, and that would, it would be less water intensive and wouldn't take away from your drinking water system, I guess, to be able to irrigate a site. But yeah, it's super important, especially trying to grow trees and things and getting them established here. We have to have some irrigation to get them going. And then hopefully at some time you can turn it off or turn it down. So once they've taken root.
Sorry, I can't find my little hand to raise my hand, but yeah, the Green Building Code, it does talk about the water usage in reusing water, doing the non-potable. That would be something we would have to work with utilities and wastewater and everything as to what can be used and what can't be. I know, and it may have changed. The city did not allow the use of gray water. So that's something that could be looked at.
Christine?
Thanks. I think there are a ton of good ideas here and in the IGCC that we can look to. And I'm really glad we're talking about this. It seems like we got really strong direction from council and from the community surveys that sustainability is a really important component of the UDC. So it seems like a good idea to use the International Green Construction Code as one source of possible language and possible ideas for some of these things, and then perhaps then move from that to what aspects of that we could adopt on the residential side. Since Karen, you were saying that the IGCC is only for commercial and multifamily. So I think it's definitely a good source of ideas, and we definitely have strong council and community direction to pursue some of these things. Another thing I heard mentioned, repeatedly by council, was the idea of a menu of options, where some things would be mandatory and perhaps large projects would have to get, say, a certain number of points from some other things to give buildings owners, builders flexibility for how they would meet some of these standards. And I'd heard council mention Golden a lot as one option for how to do that. And it does seem like Golden has some really good ideas in their list. They structure it that way too. When I was looking, some things are mandatory, and then some things a builder has to get a certain number of points. And the last comment, there were a few things in there that didn't seem to be a part of either the IECC, the energy code that we already have, or the IGCC that we could potentially consider, and that would be solar and cool roofs. So I think that those could be part of a potential menu of options like Golden has.
Kate Townley?
I guess one other thing this makes me think of in terms of this being like part of the land use code is, there's a new tool that came out, of the tree equity score tool, that looks at all these different census blocks and neighborhoods and cities around the country and scores them in terms of tree equity. And if you have that shade canopy cover and kind of preparation for those high heat days. And Inglewood, like if you look up in the northwest corner of Inglewood, that area like around Zunai Street, it has an tree equity score of 26. But then if you look down by like Duncan Park area, it has a score of 93. So if you're looking at sort of the different land use, the zoning, different zone districts or things, or different areas of the city, do you treat all of the areas the same within the code, or make certain areas have, if we need more tree cover and need more landscape cover in those areas in order to kind of get up to par, if you would have those be, different needs for different parts of the city, I guess.
Yeah, I think my immediate reaction to that one, it does bring challenges to have different standards in different parts. But one of the things I think you're hitting on with regard to landscape and the tree canopy and tree protection, and is that it's very easy to establish benchmarks, and then if there is a requirement, if you're already at that benchmark, you don't have anything to plan. So it's a way to have everyone on the same standard, but if you're deficient, you need to plan it as part of your site plan and landscape. If you don't, we want to make sure we're giving credit to existing vegetation. So that's the only thing that jumped to my mind regarding that comment, but that's some really interesting data that we're going to want to take a look at.
Others?
I had, Chris had mentioned the solar, I call it the solar rights, that it'd be nice to have some kind of regulation on what you can build. If you build a 100-foot tall apartment building, it's going to cast a shadow of 200 feet in December. And 200 feet, if it's built at where one of the building spots over there by off of the Hampton area. I don't remember the name of this location, but anyway, it would cast a shadow over to the Inglewood Parkway. And if you have a walkway that's going through there, you're going to have ice on the walkway in the winter part of the winter time. Solar rights is a huge thing, and it's getting bigger and bigger all the time. Having if you want to put up solar panels or just have the melting of the snow in the wintertime, it's a big issue.
Michelle? Oops, I'm sorry, Carl. I thought you were done.
That was just a comment, not really a question.
Michelle?
I am unaware, well, driving around the city of Inglewood, it doesn't appear many times that homeowners are, investing in their trees. There's a lot of dead trees, things like that, and I don't know the code well enough. Is there something in code enforcement there where people could be, homeowners could be asked to please, prune their trees and things like that so that we keep our canopy healthy? I guess it's a question for Wade or somebody else on staff.
Well, this is Brooke. I don't think there is not a tree protection ordinance per se for the city of Inglewood. There are certain provisions in the code for, general maintenance of trees, but it's something that does not necessarily, there's not a lot of activity associated with it. But many cities have tree preservation ordinances. And to my knowledge, the city of Inglewood does not. So that's kind of what I know about that.
Yeah, and I'll kind of just tag on from looking at other cities' codes and working on these projects. That is usually where we would see something like that. There's kind of three ways to think about that issue you brought up. One is it a general property maintenance code problem where, if it becomes such a problem, there are things probably in just the general property maintenance code or public health safety issues about the tree that could require some kind of cleanup or remediation, but it may not necessarily protect the tree. The second level is kind of what Wade's or Brooks talking about, that through requiring existing trees to be protected, you have kind of two aspects of that. One, existing trees need to be protected at what rate? There needs to be a standard at which the property needs to be appropriately treed, whether that's a percentage canopy, whether that's existing trees of a certain size. That's where those ordinances usually trigger. And then there would also be a proactive way to maintain it. And then the third level is we kind of heard in Karen's presentation as well, that when we're dealing with development application there, and particularly on the commercial side or multifamily on the residential side or large scale residential projects, there's a landscape requirement that will trigger. That's in the development review. And we've kind of already touched on every city's inherent problem is, do we go back 2 or 3 years later to make sure A, that survived, B, they're maintaining it. We can close that loophole from the development code standpoint and say every site plan that's approved becomes a standard and you need to maintain your property to that standard. The question is there enough staffing power to go out and enforce and inspect and do all that? And I'll just be honest that most times there isn't. Most times in a city, we're on-call planners for a number of cities and we don't have the time. But what we can do is we can, as complaints come in, we can go enforce them on a complaint basis when things get particularly bad. So those are just the three ways I think of getting at your issue. First brush is just general property maintenance. Second level would be if there's a tree protection standard. The third level is if we've done that through a site plan approval, we should at least have a hook to go back and make sure that they're keeping what was approved through a site plan approval up to par.
Andy?
The thing I was going to mention while we're on the subject of tree preservation, tree protection is we'll get variance cases on the Board of Appeals and Adjustment where people are trying to explain a hardship and they're referencing existing trees and if they could put an addition and they want some leeway so that they can save a tree. And it's something that we really can't consider the way a lot of the criteria are written right now. And so if tree protection is a big deal, I mean, this is something that happens a lot more, I think, than we get a lot more additions and major things happening on people's existing properties. And if we can encourage tree protection in that way, I think that'd be really helpful, at least clarity for our board.
Yeah, I think tree protection and tree preservation are definitely important issues that I don't feel like the city's code is as strong as it potentially could be. The existing code does talk about a couple of issues related to trees. For instance, not allowing the planting of certain types of trees. In fact, like cottonwoods and other, I wouldn't say cottonwoods are not invasive, but they are tend to be weak wooded trees and messy trees. But we obviously always have issues related to trees. Among them, one of the biggest right now is the emerald ash borer, and so we should be discouraging planting of certain types of trees and encouraging the planting of others. So I do think there is certainly room in the code for better practices with planting of trees, preservation of trees, maintenance of trees. And Chris is right, enforcement is always a big issue, but at least if it's in the code, there's a way to, there's at least a baseline for it. So anyways, thank you.
Judy?
I guess I'd like to see us also talk about education about, so our next door neighbor cut down a perfectly good tree on the south side, which provides shade in the summer in order to put in solar panels. And the cognitive dissonance that allows somebody to do that, to take away the shade so they can put in solar panels to use more electricity to cool their house in the summer is beyond my comprehension. It's that kind of stuff that with a focus on everybody has to have solar without a full understanding of what that means in terms of energy use. You know, I have taken hours and hours of classes on this kind of stuff, and the lack of knowledge is astounding to me. And to cut down a perfectly good tree that's providing shade in the summer in order to put in solar is just stunning to me. And it's that lack of holistic thinking about how all this works together that gets us into trouble. And I hope that we can maybe really look at what is in the best interest of the whole environment instead of limiting somebody else's, they can't plant a tree in their yard because it's going to block somebody's solar panels 10 years from now. I mean, when I watched them cut that down, a little piece of me died. I'm just going to say.
Judy, I think that's a great point. You look at what's up on the screen right now under energy use, and the number one is passive heating and cooling. And that's what you're talking about right now. There's more to just, there's angles in the summer, there's angles in the winter, and they vary, and there is a holistic approach to it, or needs to be.
Kate?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Judy. And I definitely I have a gigantic tree. I think it's older than Inglewood in my backyard. And when I looked into getting solar panels, you know, the person that came out it was basically like, there's no point in getting solar panels because this tree provides way more shade, way more energy efficiency, and way more cooling than you'll ever get out of solar panels, at least for now, you know, with who knows with the age of the tree and all of that. But then all of the additional benefits that tree provides. I think that is an incredibly important amount of information, and it's way more low tech than solar. And I think like as a city, then also that thought of, is it the most efficient and I don't know this answer, it's just that question out there, to have solar panels on everyone's house, or to have areas where we have more solar panels that there's very likely to be, you know, trees or things that are blocking those, and have more of a district approach to that kind of power, rather than it being always up to each individual. Or if you do have a tree, to not say, oh, I can only do one or the other. You can still choose to have solar, but you're just getting it from somewhere else. So that's all.
Bernie?
Yeah, I think Kate led into what I was thinking. I understand that the purpose of this discussion is for the development code, and that mostly, you know, is dictating new construction and or larger adaptive reuse and things of that nature. I think one of the things the city should be considering, though, is how we look at this from a macro perspective, both for any of these issues, whether it's solar, energy consumption, water efficiency, stormwater. I think that we need to look at what's the best practices for new construction, but also where is the city going to go and leading the way with this, with Parks and Rec and some other larger areas on the macro scale. And just a quick question for Chris, you know, the second area up there is small renewable energy facilities. For my opinion, there's so much opportunity, especially from a solar perspective, to be looking at working with development, and especially in big box scenarios, to create larger platforms for solar, use, solar areas, and to create small, energy facilities within those uses. Sometimes looking to put especially on the residential side, to put the burden on each individual home or each individual building does not necessarily make as much sense. If we could start to look at these as larger areas and take advantage of some of the accessibility that we have here, from a solar standpoint, at more of a macro scale and less of an individual site scale.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a question for me in there other than to say, like, yeah, that's a great point. We tend to see it addressed in codes at three different scales, right? The site scale, the block or district scale, and then the utility scale. So I think the one you're hitting is that middle scale, and there's certainly those are probably the ones that, if you do it in the right location, you have the least competing interests, because you aren't dealing with choices that impact a really small area of, do I want shade versus sun? Or the other one is sometimes that is wind. I don't know how. I mean, I lived in the Front Range for a while. I know you get some windy days. I don't know what the wind one is, but what I am familiar with is the building scale wind energy things are starting to become pretty interesting. I don't think they're up to a critical mass yet, but those are another one that at the site and district scale are becoming the technology is evolving that they can fit in different areas, but we'll certainly be open to all of those, both at the site and the larger scale, I think. But then I think the theme of all of these questions are, the overriding part is making sure we're educating on the big picture, so that we're not doing things that compete against the larger goal.
Kate?
I was just going to say one other thing with this is that, and I know this is like a loaded term, but sort of how do all of these different elements of sustainability play into or relate to neighborhood character or what gives your community character. And I would argue, you know, you're going to remember the street that you walk down that has trees on it, more so the street that you walk down that has individual houses with solar panels on it and no trees. So sort of how do you kind of look at that big picture as well, of the kind of community we'd like to see, either, you know, as these new developments or infill developments come on board, sort of what are those other elements that we think are really important. And I think that can go into stormwater management as well. Do you want to see a pit with a fence around it on every parking lot? Or do you want to see things that are more usable by community members and are more pleasing and soften the space? So I think it's important to think about those elements with sustainability as well.
Michelle?
Yeah, and I just wanted to sort of play off of what Brooke had mentioned about the emerald ash and the emerald ash borer. I think whenever we talk about things like this, we need to remember that we need to have diversity in our trees and diversity in all of our greenery around the town for reasons like that. When there's a really bad bug that comes and potentially could wipe out an entire species if people don't take care of it. That's why we need diversity. We also need diversity just because of the birds and all the animals and everything like that. They need the diversity. We don't want to have to make a lot of rules and say, oh, you must only plant these 5 trees or something like that. We need to keep diversity in mind because that's a healthier environment. That's all.
Anyone else have some questions or comments? Christine?
A super interesting discussion, and I happen to love trees and love solar both. It seems like we have more opportunity on the commercial and multifamily side to potentially have both, since we have more space to play with, both for the building itself and for the surrounding area. So maybe for commercial and multifamily, it's less of a trade-off between trees versus solar. Maybe on the home side, that's something that could go in the menu of options.
Yeah, Christine, I think you're talking about some realities. Big box was mentioned. You know, big box tends to be a large square footage that may have some trees around the perimeter, but in the middle of that roof, there's not going to be a lot of shade, which is ideal for solar panels. On the commercial side, I've noticed in the metro area, I don't know what Kaiser Permanente is doing, but it seems like every one of their parking lots, which also tends to be areas that aren't as shaded, they're building canopies with solar panels on them. We've had proposals from auto dealerships that are very concerned about hail and protecting their inventory, that they want to build canopies. And in some cases, those canopies have solar panels that are sort of, I guess, pre-wired, whatever you want to call it, for electric vehicles, because that's the way they see the industry going. So some of those larger investments that are a little higher tech have, you know, certain appropriate places. And perhaps on the residential side, while you wouldn't want to limit anything, some of the lower technology solutions may be more in keeping with neighborhood character and some of the other things we've been discussing tonight.
Okay, I don't see any more hands. Chris, oh, see Andy, as soon as I say that, somebody comes on. Thanks, Andy. Go ahead.
Does our code currently allow for solar to be placed like on ground? I know there's some places that restrict that and only allow it to be on a roof. I guess my question is just whether we can build in some more flexibility so that that property owners can try and find the right solution that helps them where they do have access to that sunlight.
Our code does currently allow it to be placed on the ground. It's been a little bit more of an interpretation. We treat those on-ground solar panels as accessory structures, so there is a limit to their square footage of their footprint. Certainly our current code did not or does not foresee on the ground solar panels, so that's something that should probably be addressed. So yes, hope that's the best I can answer that question.
Christine?
Thanks. On a different note, something else I'd like to see on the energy side, besides cool roofs and besides solar where it's appropriate, is thinking ahead for the transition to electric heating and water heating, zero emission heating and water heating. And I'm thinking here of heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. At a minimum, I would like if we could at least preserve consumer choice so that in the future, if a homeowner or a building owner wants to switch to high efficiency electric heating and water heating, they can do so. So we put in the outlet and the panel capacity so that they don't have to totally rip out their walls and panel and redo that one if they do want to switch to electric heating and cooling. So I'd like if we could think about that, and then perhaps if we did have a menu of options, one of the things for additional points could be all electric without necessarily requiring that for all buildings right now. I thought Karen had some good points about how we're moving in that direction, but we're not going to switch all over to all electric tomorrow. But we do want to put some of the pieces in place so that as that transition is happening, we're future proofing our homes and making sure that we can make that change. We have plenty of studies now showing that it can be done at a cost savings to the home or the building owner if it's new construction. Retrofits are a little harder, so new construction seems like a good place to do that. And we've also seen that Excel has enough electric capacity for the switch to heat pumps and heat pump water heaters, because they're built for summer peaking load, and this would add winter heating load. So we heard that it wouldn't impact reliability at the grid scale. So I think we're getting a lot of the pieces in place, and if that was an option in our menu or in the UDC itself, I'd love to see that.
Karen?
Yes, we could certainly look at either doing a requirement or providing some kind of incentive to do the dual energy options on new builds, so that, you know, somebody could, you know, the current owner may want to use gas, but a future owner might want to use electric, or, you know, as time goes by, it's kind of like with toilets, you know, you can't find a toilet like you used to, right? You have to buy a low flow toilet. And I think it'll eventually get that way with some of the gas appliances, and that they'll be harder to come by. So people will eventually have to convert over to electric. So certainly something we could look at as a requirement or as another option if we did some kind of point system.
Kate?
I was just going to say, I think another example of that could be with the parking design and for structured parking. I've seen some communities put in, I think you can get, I don't know if it's extra points or a bonus or something, if your parking structure, at least your first floor, can be converted into some other sort of use at a future time. If it's not being used for parking. And I think that that can have a big impact for, you know, whether it's housing or whether it's for, you know, activating the street with more commercial space or things like that. But to just be thinking about parking differently, and especially if it's required structured parking or and something that has that street frontage.
Others? If not, Chris, Wade, Brooke, do you have, or Karen, do you have anything further?
That is all I had. I don't know if Chris has any further questions or anything.
No, I don't think so. I just appreciate the discussion, and it's very useful information for us. So look forward to coming back with some strategies and options.
Okay. Well, that is it for tonight then, and we will see you in 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Wade.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Right.
Everyone.